Hello, this is U.S. History since 1877. My name is Derek Taylor. This is our lecture on the Civil Rights Movement. Until we have built Jerusalem, 1941 and 1973. If my voice sounds funny, by the way, I'm a little under the weather, so hopefully you can understand what I'm saying. I'll try to enunciate as well as I can. Excuse me. A lecture on the Civil Rights Movement, how it comes to fruition in the 1970s, and how it divides the country. It does. And in fact, the last lecture was on the Cold War, early part of the Cold War, when there seemed to be consensus in the country. This comes to an end permanently, really, in the 1960s, and a divide opens up which really has never healed. And two things basically do this: race, which has to do with the Civil Rights Movement, and then the Vietnam War. And so this is the first of two lectures for this section. They go together pretty well with chapters in your textbook. So let's dive into this and see how this happened. A little overview. I'll talk about the changing nature of rights. Ideas are part of this. I'm going to talk about the Cold War more than you might think for this event in American history, very important event. We'll go through the legal and legislative milestones, but also the effects of the civil rights movement, its outcomes, but also the effects of the new, I call it a civil rights regime because it has, it's a new set of institutions that are created to try to enforce new civil rights laws. And so you have the end of the Cold War consensus beginning in the 1960s, as I mentioned. The events of the 60s, they basically demolish the sort of amity between Republicans and Democrats that existed in the Cold War, which was always historically out of the ordinary anyway. But all sorts of things come to an end. Consensus about not just Cold War, but consensus about race, the family, stuff about this, a whole host of other things. But also the end of economic prosperity by the end of the 60s. Well, that's what makes the sort of divisions that open up really interesting. They start opening up at the height of American prosperity. The American economic dominance reaches its apogee just as about things begin to sort of fall apart. And there are a lot of reasons for this. I don't really have a great handle on all of this, but I'm give you my own view about this. And I think one of the things that happens coming out of Second World War, Cold War, you have this two things. One, you have this drive to unite Americans for the purpose of the war, then for the Cold War. And the continuous drumbeat of Cold War propaganda, our way of life is better than yours, vis-a-vis the Soviets, must have made some Americans, especially younger ones in that period that grew up after World War II, take a long, hard look at things going on in American life. Again, things like racial questions, stuff like this. And they determined that it wasn't so great after all. The American dream, and I'm thinking mostly of upper middle class, we're talking about elites here. And there have been divisions. If you go back to 1920, remember the Scopes trial? They've been kind of there beneath the surface anyway. Having said all that, the divisions, you could say in another way, is just between a tiny minority of the elite and most American people. Most of the movements we'll talk about in the next couple of lectures didn't really touch most people in the country. Even the riots, the marches, the protests, the speeches, and so forth. Most people still retained an older sense of American belief in the uniqueness and goodness of their country. And so, in a weird way, I think even the people who were protesting to a certain extent shared that idea. I think what happened is it changed radically under the pressures of the 1960s, as we'll see. And so it is the sort of clash of those ideas, because what's going to effectively come out of this in the 60s is a critique. On the left, there's a little bit on the right too, but basically America has become corrupt. It needs to be reshaped. And this is what's going to fuel what's sometimes called the rights revolution. This, of course, is the most glaring injustice uh, that's paramount in the 1960s, is what goes on in the South. African Americans are subject to, all sorts of humiliations, but also violence in the South. And you're going to see this stuff. Well, this is what pushes the rights revolution into, we call it rights revolution because, as you're going to see, it starts with African Americans. And the movement to use the power of the federal government to rectify that becomes the template for, well, everything else, or anything else you can get away with, basically, since the 1960s. And the country finally confronting the legacy of slavery and segregation is both an effect, but also a cause of a lot of the changes that happened in the 60s. And of course, the elimination of legal discrimination in the South did not eliminate racism, but it begins the process of making racism an untenable position in public life. And as I said before, it led to what sometimes scholars call rights consciousness. Of groups now all of a sudden are aware, oh wait, if we appeal to the government, they will try to redress our grievances. Whereas never had before because nobody thought they would. But now that they've done this for the African Americans, it begins to proliferate. And under this pressure, you get a change in the way people view rights in this country. Several ways, two ways. One, your textbook mentions, is the idea that rights are primarily for individuals gives way to an idea that rights are a matter of groups. And in particular, the rights as a sort of absolute entitlement to not only, legal rights, political rights, voting rights, but even things like psychological satisfaction. And again, maybe that's not news to you because you grew up in a world shaped by this, but it was really radical. I guess it's radical now, but to the least, the whole rights revolution is going to sort of wipe out that 1950s sense of consensus permanently. The other major, let's say, shift in emphasis has always been there, but people talked about civil rights. This is a movement for civic rights, right? Rights that are enshrined into law, written by legislatures. In fact, this idea is going to get conflated with human rights. Why is that a big deal? Human rights are very different than civil rights. Civil rights are things the government can create and take away from you. Human rights are not. Human rights, at least so the theory goes, they occur in nature. They occur outside any sort of political order. I say this because pressing human rights can be, destructive of social order, because you're basically saying that these rights have no limits to them. And that sense of, civil rights as human rights is going to play a big, huge role in our country, because every great change has been made in the past 50 years in terms of, you take, what's happened in your lifetime, things like the March of Gay Rights and stuff like this happened because it wasn't just a matter of, civic rights. Oh, it's like a natural right or human right. And you're, only the devil would, oppose a human right. And so this leads to the situation in which we live now. If you can press your claim to the government as a violation of civil rights, you're going to get it. Nothing is allowed to stand in the way of those types of rights. So it radically alters our political life together. And I began talking about this in the Cold War context. This is the map of all the sort of nations that gained independence in the globe during the Cold War. Why do I put this map out there? Well, it's in your book probably, or a newer edition of your book anyway. I do this because this rights talk I talked about doesn't exist in a vacuum in the United States. It's kind of everywhere. In 1948, the United Nations issues its UN Declaration of Human Rights. This is, by the way, UN Declaration of Human Rights. You will have civil rights activists making mention of it in the 1960s. Martin Luther King Jr. does so. They're very aware of the civil rights activists in America, African Americans and otherwise, of what's going on in the rest of the world. And as you're going to see, this is linked to the Second World War and the Cold War. And the first thing is that in the 1950s, racial segregation and economic discrimination defined the lives of African Americans. There were about 15 million African Americans in 1950, about 10% of the population. In the South, however, they made between 30 and 50% of the population of several states. Legal segregation there, known as Jim Crow, prevailed in pretty much every aspect of public life in the South. 2/3 of African Americans lived in the South, and they could not do things like eat in restaurants with whites, use the same waiting rooms at bus stations, use the same water fountains. You've heard this before. It's legally enforced. In the North, racial segregation is not legal, but it still exists. You have, basically voluntarily whites and blacks living in different neighborhoods. Say voluntarily for the most part. There's also discrimination in the North. However, there is far greater freedom for African Americans in the northern and western states than in the South. In these states, blacks could vote, participate in politics, and after the early 1960s, enjoy equal access to public accommodation. However, and this is of course very clear by the 1960s, blacks, of course, are impoverished, and this is widely, at a much higher rate than whites, is obvious to everyone. So all these things come under the microscope as you approach the 1960s. Now, several things came together in the 50s and 60s to make this movement a success. One of these, and then this goes back to, and this may sound counterintuitive, but I'll explain this, is the pretty expansive growth of the Black middle class from the early decades of the 20th century to the middle of the 20th century. It experienced really big growth, especially after World War II. Again, the post-war boom lifted everybody's boats, and pretty much most all of the civil rights leaders that you know from history come from the middle classes. It makes sense. They're the ones who have time and money to do this stuff. Again, this is partly what I think causes the consciousness this is a problem, because all of a sudden there are a lot more blacks who actually have money, but also there's that continuing disparity in terms of wealth and stuff like this between they and white Americans, which, by the way, as we'll see, still persists. The other thing, of course, other major institutions involved in this are the Black churches. They had long been a sanctuary for Black Americans, and so they're one of the major institutions that are involved in this. A lot of them are pastors. Again, Martin Luther King is one of the big ones. Also, African-American college students, again, who are part of the largest expansion of college enrollment in U.S. history, because again, even blacks are beginning to go to college, join this movement. They'll add fresh ideas to this. So you have those factors, I think, playing a role. The other thing is the role of television. As you're going to see here, a lot of the, and you know this because you've seen it on YouTube and stuff, I'm assuming, the big confrontations with authorities in the South take place on television in the 1950s and 60s. And this is crucial because it lets people in the North and the West who don't know much about the South know what's going on down there. And in fact, as you are going to see, civil rights leaders are very aware of this. They pick fights with, we'll get to this in a moment, in places like Birmingham, with sheriffs they know will react with violence. They're trying to provoke this so they can get attention. So shrewd planning on the part of the civil rights leaders. I mentioned this before, but some of this begins, especially some of the sort of hardball that these civil rights leaders play with the government, begins during FDR's administration during World War II. Think of A. Philip Randolph, who called for a march on Washington in 1941, was going to bring 100,000 people to Washington. This is when FDR backed down and issued an executive order prohibiting racial discrimination in defense industries. So he canceled the march. But again, that's that sense that Americans were fighting against fascism, right? Fighting against this, people who hate Jews in the Nazis. It fired up African Americans because it seemed like, hey, they're going to, they're getting the government's getting on board, getting against discrimination in this way. This leads to things like the Double V campaign, which was a patriotic racial slogan that spread through Black communities during the World War II. Again, the idea was to demonstrate love of country by fighting the Axis powers. And so you have strikes going on during World War II, African Americans. And so you'll have also have tensions, race riots and things like this, because they were working in industries they hadn't known before. But it's an opportunity for their leaders to, again, try to make their claim for full enforcement of the laws protecting them. The other thing that really, again, ramps this up is the Cold War. The Cold War added a lot of pressure to U.S. leaders. Again, the United States was trying to build a grand coalition, both in Europe, but also in developing nations in America and Africa. And as Harry Truman explained, he said, quote, "We must correct the remaining imperfections in our practice of democracy." And Truman could use racist language, but he supported civil rights. He's the one who integrated the army during the Korean War. And he started issuing executive orders. This will be an important thing here. He appointed a presidential committee on civil rights. And again, under pressure from A. Philip Randolph, he's the one who will sign an executive order desegregating the armed forces. This is done through executive orders. This is part of an expansion of executive authority in this period. It's going to be used for a variety of things. That's part of the civil rights movement as well. But even more directly, the Cold War struggle meant they had to act on civil rights. Why? Because the Soviet Union routinely used American, racism in the South and elsewhere as a means of discrediting the United States in places like Africa, Latin America, and Asia. And so, they could easily get a hold of that, TV coverage and show it to people back in the Soviet Union. Dogs being sicked on blacks in the South. And again, federal government was aware of this. Black activists were aware of this. It is part of this push-pull. It's part of the reason. It's one of the big reasons why the government, for the federal government, for the first time, is actually responsive to some of their demands. Here you have wartime workers, Black women in factories there during the Second World War, which of course African Americans did, supported their country during the war. Again, expecting, that the federal government would finally keep up their end of the bargain. And this is also another thing about this. It's patterns of migration. And it's another thing. Both of the world wars, mentioned World War I did this, but also World War II has the effect of African Americans branching out of the South, going to other places. This will also, again, be part of this, making people more aware of their plight as you get to the 1960s. Excuse me. Now, when I say battle in the course 1954 to 62, I mean, one of the things about this is that the NAACP, excuse me, was founded in the early 20th century, and they began to grow, and they've been bringing court cases, lawsuits for decades. And in the 1940s, their legal team began to use a tactic of striking at legal segregation in graduate education, separate but equal. And in the South, no university would accept a Black person to a PhD program, and no Black institution offered them in the 1940s. So Thurgood Marshall, who was the counsel for the NAACP, litigated through various levels of the federal court system for several years before getting a breakthrough in 1950, when the Supreme Court ordered the state of Texas to limit a plaintiff to an all-white law school. And so they're using test cases to try to test the law and to overturn it, or try to get it overturned. And they soon moved on to local level, and they brought 5 lawsuits against local school districts before the Supreme Court in 1954. One from Virginia, one from Delaware, Washington, D.C., South Carolina, and the one for whom the case that they eventually won was named Topeka, Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education in 1954. And the decision involved Linda Brown, who's a Black pupil in Topeka, Kansas, who'd been forced to attend a segregated school halfway across town while there was a white school nearby. Thurgood Marshall argued that the segregation was unconstitutional because it denied Linda Brown the quote equal protection of the law, protection of the laws guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. And the funny thing about this Brown versus Board of Education, it didn't actually rule on that. It didn't even mention the 14th Amendment. It just basically decreed that segregation was against the Constitution. And Justice Earl Warren, who was the head of the court at that point, had been, it's interesting to note, had been California's Attorney General in 1942 when he helped the government intern Japanese American citizens. He felt remorse for this action. And so they overturned long-standing precedent without really justifying it in terms of previous jurisprudence. And it sets a really powerful, and some would say too powerful, even some liberal legal scholars, because at a stroke, they basically just decreed that laws that had passed with the support of wide majorities were now unconstitutional. Historians still debate, by the way, whether or not legal segregation could have ended without the intervention of the courts, but it is definitely I think you have to say it's an expansion of the court's power. Conservative critics like to see it at the origins of what they call judicial activism, whether you accept their whatever their policy prescriptions. They're right, this is unprecedented amount of power they brought upon themselves. It's also interesting to note, by the way, not everyone was on board with the decision, even in the African American community. Someone like Zora Neale Hurston, a novelist and author, was opposed to the decision, mainly because she thought it was a bad idea to force people to live and work together who didn't like each other. And yet it becomes the basis for, again, the establishment of new rights, that legal basis for the rights revolution. In the South, of course, they decried this as an attack on the white establishment. They called for massive resistance. You had Southerners joining what they called white citizens councils, people dedicated to blocking school integration. Ku Klux Klan all of a sudden got a new membership. Violence and intimidation would begin in earnest. We'll see this in a moment. Dwight Eisenhower, who was the president at the time, thought the decision was a mistake. But he, the president, he agreed to enforce it as the law of the land, which he did. And in 1957, in Little Rock, Arkansas, 9 Black students attempted to enroll in an all-white high school. The governor called out the National Guard to bar them. Then a mob took over the whole scene on television. Night after night, 9 students had to run a gauntlet of angry whites chanting things like "Go back to the jungle," trying to get to school. And again, the sort of television coverage forced Eisenhower to act. He sent 1,000 federal troops to Little Rock and nationalized the National Guard, ordering them to protect the Black students. No sitting president had used federal troops for anything within the United States since Reconstruction. It's a momentous decision. It's also, you've kind of crossed the line. You're going to use, the threat of violent force. So government's getting serious about this. And then finally, in 1962, the Supreme Court case, Bailey versus Patterson, case brought from African Americans from Mississippi, declares segregation in transportation facilities to be unconstitutional. So within less than a decade, all of a sudden you begin to have the federal government intervening and beginning to try to wipe away these things in the South, this legal discrimination. You can kind of see the march of this. And again, it goes back, the Supreme Court cases to the 1930s, going up through the 1950s and 60s, leading up to the Brown versus Board of Education there. Here's an image, as you can see, of the scene from Little Rock in 1957. You can see all the cameras there, reporters. You have, you have the white students trying to intimidate them and stuff like this. So it became, images people saw that moved them and the government. At the same time, you begin to have attempts at non-violent civil disobedience to try to undermine legal and other types of discrimination. Most famously, the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955, which was initiated by Rosa Parks in Montgomery, Alabama, when she refused to give her seat on a city bus to a white man. Your textbook says she's a seamstress. It must be said she was very brave, but she was not just an ordinary citizen. She was a member of the local NAACP, and she did so on purpose to test the segregation law. She'd actually been trained as a labor organizer. She went to an academy in Tennessee for high school, which was founded by the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which was a labor union. So she was already well trained in these types of things. And in fact, after her arrest, a local women's organization began to organize the boycott. They all were. They were all trained activists. They weren't just old ladies in knitting clubs or something. And they looked for someone, however, to head their organization. And they turned to a local minister, Black church, Martin Luther King Jr., who, of course, was also son of a prominent Black minister from Atlanta, Georgia. Again, middle class. Got his PhD in theology. And this point in his career was embracing the teachings of Mohandas Gandhi on violence, and so trying to lead a campaign of passive resistance. And he endorsed the plan by the Black Women's Organization to boycott the Montgomery bus system until it was integrated. And again, King was one of the people who was shrewd in purposely embracing nonviolence, but in places he knew there'd be a violent reaction to elicit sympathy for the cause. After a year, the boycott came to an end when the Rosa Parks case came before the Supreme Court, and it struck it down as unconstitutional. The ordinance segregating it as unconstitutional. What's interesting about this is that it was the court that again settled the issue, even though there was a lot of movement here. Even Thurgood Marshall at the time was kind of unimpressed by King's efforts. He wrote, quote, "All that walking for nothing. They might as well have waited for the court's decision," he said in the quote. Also commenting in private that King was, quote, "a boy on a man's errand," unquote. Marshall did contribute money to get him out of prison, however. But again, these even these types of decisions by the Supreme Court didn't end segregation, because you had citizens' councils and their allies finding ways around this. It wouldn't be till the second wave of protests hit the 60s in response to violence in the South which will begin to have this change. And then, as you'll see, beyond that, attempts at integration, coerced integration in the 60s and 70s. But the Montgomery bus boycott catapulted King to national prominence. And in 1957, he formed, along with Ralph Abernathy, another minister, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference based in Atlanta. And again, so this becomes the sort of Christian activist element within the one of the parts of the civil rights movement. You also have another strategy being used of sit-ins from 1960 onward. In February of that year, 4 Black college students sat down at a whites-only lunch counter at a local Woolworths, and the idea was to sit in until they were served. They were arrested, but the tactic worked. Again, brought attention to the Woolworths, unwanted media attention, and so they desegregated the counters, and so the sit-in spread to other states. Finally, you have the so-called Freedom Rides of 1961. After the sit-in started, the SCLC helped organize the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC as they call it, to facilitate these sit-ins by Black students. And so they began launching sit-ins all across the South. Hold on, I guess I leave it there. And eventually, you have African American, but also white college students, as you can kind of see from the image, doing this as well. And SNCC will emerge as the most important student protest organization in the country, and will again sort of initiate the whole generation of college students. Then finally, the Congress of Racial Equality organized a series of what were called Freedom Rides in 1961 on interstate bus lines in the South. Again, the aim getting to call attention to violations of recent Supreme Court rulings against segregation in interstate commerce. Both black and white activists were attacked by mobs, and outside a town in Alabama, one bus was firebombed. Despite the violence, the authorities initially refused to intervene, although he basically eventually, Attorney General, his brother Robert Kennedy, sent federal marshals to Alabama to restore order. And by the way, just to give you an idea, show you the picture there, the sit-ins, but again, this is a picture, again, segregated restaurant in Virginia. What happens is you begin to have confrontations in the South leading to violence. Again, part of this is planned. Martin Luther King picketed Birmingham, Alabama's department stores in 1963. And again, intentionally, television cameras caught Bull Connors, the sheriff, using fire hoses and sticking dogs on them. He's arrested for leading the march, and this is when he writes his letter from the Birmingham jail. Eloquent statement on using nonviolent, political means. But it forced Kennedy to give a speech on television. He promised major legislation banning discrimination in public places, and so you begin to sense this is going to, the civil rights leaders do, their time has come. So this is when they organized the March on Washington, D.C., organized by A. Philip Randolph, by the way, the older African-American activist. Bunch of people, you've seen the pictures. This is when it culminates in the march on the mall in Washington, D.C. King gives his I Have a Dream speech. And it seems like, at least as a high point of King's, popularity at that point. But you're already beginning to have differences of opinion grow within the civil rights movement. At the same time, Southern senators were trying to block this proposed civil rights legislation, and there's an outbreak of violence in the South. 4 Black Sunday school students are killed when a church is bombed in Birmingham, 1964. After Kennedy's assassination, Lyndon Johnson went before Congress and got them to approve the most far-reaching civil rights law really that's ever passed, as we'll see. Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlaws discrimination and employment on the basis of race, religion, national origin, and sex. Another section guarantees equal access to public accommodations in schools. As we'll see, it actually does a lot more than that. We'll come back to it, but it is a far, far-reaching piece of legislation. And yet the violence continues. In 1964, Black organizations mounted a campaign in Mississippi, the Freedom Summers, which drew volunteers from the North, including white college students, where they went down there and established schools for children, conducted voter registration drives. And but the opposition was fierce and violent. Only about 1,200 Black voters were registered. 4 civil rights workers were killed, and 37 Black churches were bombed or burned. And so in response to this, James Bevel of the SCLC in 1965 called for a march from Selma, Alabama to the state capitol in Montgomery to protest the murder of one of these voting rights activists. As soon as the marchers left Selma, crossing over the bridge, United States troopers attacked them with tear gas and clubs. Again, also shown on national television that night. And this led to President Johnson going back to Congress, and a Voting Rights Act was passed on August 6, 1965, outlawing all the literacy tests and other devices that prevented Blacks from registering to vote, and authorized the Attorney General to send federal examiners to register voters in any county where the registration was less than 50%. And within 10 years or so, the amount of Blacks registered to vote went from 20% in 1960 to 62% in 1971. And so you have in law the culmination of what began back in the 1870s, law, but also the willingness of the federal government to enforce laws in the South if they had not had before. As we're going to see, and we'll see this more in the next lecture as well, you'll also begin to reshape the Democratic Party because they're the ones responsible for this. And the liberal wing of the Democratic Party is going to be at its height around 1965 or so. It defeats its conservative segregationist wing. However, it's also going to lead to reshaping of the Democratic Party, as we'll see the more, again, next lecture as well. But it's a huge turning point for the country and for the Democratic Party. And you can kind of see again here some of the things that happened from the 1950s and 60s, efforts by activists and the federal government, Brown versus Board of Education, Little Rock, those sorts of things over the South. So there's this extraordinary mobilization to deal with, people thought of as the sort of, sore spot of the South where, law didn't apply equally, where you had legal segregation. Again, you can see some of these pictures here. This is the picture of Birmingham protesters in '63. And then the march from Selma into Montgomery in 1965. Again, the images are very important. Excuse me. Then you can see the total number of Black voters going up from 64 to 75 in all these states as a result of the Voting Rights Act. Excuse me. However, at the same time this is going on, all of a sudden, almost as soon as the last pieces of legislation get passed and the mechanisms for enforcement are created at the federal level, you begin to have the radicalization of the civil rights movement. At the time, you have the rise of the philosophy of Black nationalism. This could mean nothing more than the pride in one's community. It could also mean total separation from the wider world. And one of the early leaders of this exponent of Black nationalism was the Nation of Islam, which is it's not really like most Muslims don't consider them to be orthodox, put it that way. It's kind of off kilter theologically speaking. But it comes out of the Black experience and basically refuses a rejection of Christianity with a philosophy of self-reliance. And Black Muslims in the Nation of Islam are known by their strict, their dress code, dark suits, white shirts, ties, so on and so forth. And they produced a very charismatic leader, Malcolm X, who preached militant separatism, although he advocated violence only for self-defense. He was hostile to most mainstream civil rights organizations. He referred to the 1960 March on Washington as the farce on Washington. But after 1964, after a power struggle with the founder of the Nation of Islam, Elijah Muhammad, he broke with the Nation of Islam while remaining a Black nationalist. But he moderated his views somewhat on white people and began to talk of a class struggle uniting rich and poor, Black and white. However, he was assassinated on February 21st, 1965, by 3 members of the Nation of Islam. At the same time, a more secular brand of Black nationalism emerged in 1966 when some activists from SNCC and from the Congress on Religious Freedom began to call for Black self-reliance under the banner of what they called Black Power. It's a slogan, basically, again, rejecting discrimination, injustice, and in this sense, more to militantly reject white society, to emphasize Black pride, self-determination, so on and so forth. One of the most radical of these groups was the Black Panthers, founded in Oakland, California in 1966 by 2 college students, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. The West Coast is, by the way, where a lot of radical groups come from. The 2 or 3 ladies who founded the Black Lives Matter organization, all from Oakland, California. And the Black Panthers build themselves as a self-defense organization. The idea is they're going to protect African Americans from police violence. And they basically took their inspiration from Malcolm X. They also sort of provided like a lot of radical troops do, they provided services to the local communities. Black Panthers provided a free breakfast program for children. And again, this is, made them popular in their communities. They also combined this with a radicalism and belief in armed self-defense, which led to clashes with police. And the Panthers became one of the more violent groups involved in all this. And you did also have blacks getting involved in urban politics, inspired by things like Black Power. By early 1970s, you begin to have several major cities elect black mayors: Detroit, Atlanta, Cleveland, Washington, D.C. And so you have this, you have this odd alliance. I say alliance because this is going to be embraced by the more left wing of the Democratic Party. We're going to have these upper middle class, sometimes very wealthy white liberals embracing these radical black activists. There's a famous article, you can find it on the internet, you should go read it, by Tom Wolfe, the late author, called Radical Chic. It's about his attendance at this party in the early 1970s at the New York apartment of Leonard Bernstein, who was is a famous conductor, so musician or whatever, classical. Anyway, the whole thing is basically making fun of these hoity-toity upper middle class Manhattanites who are fraternizing with, it's not just black. These Panthers are kind of, some of them be violent. So it's an interesting comment on the whole issue of this. This, by the way, is a picture from the 1968 Olympics. And I can't remember the guy's name in the middle. Tommy, his first name's Tommy. I can't remember the last one, but this was the two runners who went and did a protest on the stand when they won their medals, raising the Black Power salute, single fist with a black glove. They had their medals taken from them, by the way, at the same time. But this is where you get the sort of militant politicizing of things like sports and public life. Again, trying to force change on people, which of course we're living with today, obviously. You can't avoid this stuff. And it's, again, in your lifetimes, you've probably never known a time when you couldn't. It used to not be that way. Like sports didn't have anything to do with politics, but it does now. There's a picture of Malcolm X. That's from 1963, but I can't be sure. And then a couple of pictures of, on the left-hand side, the Black Panther Party. You see that decked out with a bandolero, shotguns, stuff like that. And on the right-hand side, Native American activism, because you're also going to have rights groups proliferate. We'll also get into this as well. And by the late 60s, you also begin to have, mid-1960s, I should say, you begin to have violence break out. The first so-called long hot summer starts in 1964 in New York when police shoot a black criminal suspect in Harlem. There's looting and rioting as a result of this. Over the next 4 years, there would be riots set off in reaction to police brutality in dozens of cities. One of the worst in 1965 occurred in the Watts section of Los Angeles, which sparked 6 days of rioting and left 34 people dead. But in 1967, there were a whole host of riots, in 22 cities in July and August of that year. 43 people were killed in Detroit alone, most of them black, and $50 million of the property was destroyed. Lyndon Johnson had to call in the National Guard and the U.S. Army to quell the disturbances. So again, things that were happening in the 60s come back in your lifetime. Following this, you begin to have President Johnson begin to create a presidential commission to try to look at the causes of the riots. They determine, among other things, poverty as a part of all this. But you also have this begin to lead to a change in the attitudes of Martin Luther King. He begins to criticize Congress and the president for prioritizing the war in Vietnam over ending poverty. He's planning a massive poor people's campaign to fight economic injustice. And he takes a more, I'll get this at the end of the lecture, he takes a more critical view of the United States and is sometimes recognized on the end of his life. And anyway, he was going to advance that cause. He went to Memphis, Tennessee to support a strike by black sanitation workers, where he was assassinated on April 4th, 1968 by James Earl Ray. His death set off another round of urban rioting, with violence breaking out in more than 100 cities. It really was chaotic. People thought the country was coming apart at the end of the 1960s, and it will definitely bleed into, as we'll get to next time, the Democratic Party, who basically tears itself apart over this. In the intervening year, in the ensuing melee. At the same time, you begin to have a proliferation of rights groups. I'll mention a couple here. There's Latin American activism, this called Chicano movement, also sort of got in on this act. Cesar Chavez, the labor union organizer, and Dolores Huerta, who worked for the Community Service Organization, a California group founded in the 50s to promote Mexican political participation in civil rights. Together, he left that organization to Chavez in the 60s to focus on, agricultural workers, became a union organizer. And he began to organize a series of boycotts of companies. And again, brought him, publicity. Excuse me. And so you had, Mexican movements, Mexican Americans beginning to push for things like status of Spanish language in schools, also beginning to petition for the changes in immigration policy. Immigration policy did change, by the way, in 1965. That was the first time the United States had repealed one of those acts that had been passed in the 1920s. And so you're going to begin to have more militant activism. The militant activism of the African American movement spread to other groups like Native Americans, who also labor to this day under, really high unemployment rates, high rates of poverty. They begin forming their own institutions. I'll give you one example. One is in 1960, the National Indian Youth Council. Another one is the Indian of all tribes, the American Indian movement, which attracted a lot of attention. They, again, copying African American activism, they embraced the concept of red power. They began in the late 60s staging protests to draw attention to Indian concerns. In 1973, one of the more spectacular of these happened at Wounded Knee. Remember Wounded Knee, to commemorate the massacre at Wounded Knee. In February of that year, you had activists occupying a small collection of buildings for more than 2 months. So they were surrounded by FBI agents, and eventually there were several gun battles. And so, again, you have this escalating, escalating rhetoric and into violence. And if you're wondering why did all the violence and stuff happen after the legislation got passed? Well, the thing that the younger generation, I think, of civil rights leaders learned was when blacks pushed hard, they got what they wanted. So what happened is, of course, once they got the legislation, they wanted more. It began sort of, escalating, upping the ante. It sort of led to all this. And so you get, when the government, didn't want to go along with it, you get conflict. You have a picture of Dolores Huertas on the left and Hugo Cesar Chavez on the right. And you see the pictures in the background, Bobby Kennedy and Mohandas Gandhi, inspirer of nonviolence. And so by the early 1970s, you have a very new, and I've kind of gone, I don't want to bore you too much with like bureaucratic history, but you have a new, really a new regime in place. I'm calling it a rights regime for a reason. I need to stress again how sweeping the Civil Rights Act was. And two things about it. I mean, one is that it's tied to the Cold War. Again, that's one of the reasons why you have immigrants. When it says national origins in terms of the groups it covers, it means immigrants. Is that it's tied to the Cold War, obviously. It's tied to, how America is seen in the world. But it's also tied to the concerns of middle class activists. Almost all the people Again, save for some of the African Americans and the other groups, they're not. Well, some of them, some of them are, but almost all the major players are middle class activists. And one of the reasons it's so sweeping about what it's so a big change about the Civil Rights Act is it allows the federal government to levy fines and to bring lawsuits against private entities in a way unprecedented. Although it's kind of symptomatic of what I talked about last time of the blurring of public and private concerns in the Cold War era. And in fact, there is a specific language sections committed to not only aimed at businesses in terms of discrimination, but also labor unions. And again, I think it's significant that the one group, it covers, race, religion, sex, nationality. It doesn't cover? Class. There are no civil rights protections in there for people in the working class. Why? These are all middle class concerns. Upper middle class, really. The second thing goes back to this question about civil rights or human rights. Even before the outbreak of violence and the growth of the Black Power movement, you had, people talking about a more radical change that I think a lot of people were aware of. A. Philip Randolph, the guy who one of the organizers of the 1963 March on Washington, in his opening remarks that day on that march, said this, quote, "The sanctity of private property takes second place to the sanctity of human personality," unquote. What does he mean by that? Well, we'll get to this in a second about some of the scope of enforcement. But I mentioned Martin Luther King became more radical as he got older. He even addressed the Riverside Church in 1967 in New York City, in which he said, quote, "If we are to get on the right side of the world revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values," unquote. Why am I mentioning all this? Because most Americans, and again, this includes white Americans, I think what they thought was the civil rights legislation, its enforcement would end an historic discrimination. But, however, Black leaders and also white civil rights activists didn't see it that way. They saw it as the beginning of something. This is where you get this extensive rights regime coming from. The federal government sets up within the various government agencies an Office of Civil Rights. There's already a commission, but they expand these things greatly. But basically every branch of the government now has an Office of Civil Rights Affairs or something like this, where basically you can sort of sue for any sort of reason if you can convince the government that your rights have been violated. And surveys of public opinion at the time indicate that most Americans, especially white Americans, didn't understand the scale of the change that would take place. Opinion polls, for example, showed that whites favored a slow, gradual process of enforcing and ensuring civil rights for African Americans, opposed to blacks who want to change faster for obvious reasons. To give you one example, at the time they were arguing the Civil Rights Act of 1964, when legislatures raised the prospect that the government would do things like, have quotas for the number of blacks who would be hired in government, in the government, for government contracting, even for private business, that this would be required, or they would, forcibly try to integrate schools through busing. They were mocked for it and said, "You're just an extremist." They, and these are not just Southern, racist opponents of this, but pretty much it was fairly widespread. This fear that it might go farther than this, because most people, they were assured, no, we're just going to enforce rights that already exist. Of course, all those things happened. And this happened because, the means of enforcement the administrative means to enforce this became very powerful very quickly for a lot of reasons, partly because the nature of the legislation itself. Its language is very sweeping. It doesn't talk about, when you read the Civil Rights Act, of remedying the specific discrimination. Again, obviously, we just mentioned it covers a lot of groups. It doesn't mention, hey, you can't do this stuff to, it doesn't mention the South. It's aimed at everybody, especially like in the Northwest. People thought, hey, we need to get rid of this, legal discrimination. It's awfully bad. It leads to a lot of, violence and brutality against blacks. They didn't think, a lot of them, people didn't think a lot of those places it would apply to them. It did. And I say the civil rights bureaucracy that was created became powerful, partly because the federal courts basically deferred to it ever since. Whatever these, commissions, whatever these, civil rights organizations within the government, bring, they tend to get deference from the Supreme Court and the federal courts. The Voting Rights Act, for example, allowed the government to quote unquote compel affirmative action, unquote, that's where the language affirmative action comes from, or quote, any other equitable relief as the court deems appropriate, unquote, provided that employers or institutions have, quote, intentionally engaged in an unlawful practice, unquote. That's very sweeping language. It doesn't say, by the way, at that point that they've unlawful, it's pretty striking. President Johnson issued an executive order, same summer as the Voting Rights Act, that required any private company with at least 51 employees to set up an affirmative action program if it was going to seek government contracts. So it ties this to federal funding. And to give you an idea of how this spreads really quickly, by 1971, you have a Supreme Court case called Griggs versus Duke Power Company, in which the Supreme Court decided a case in which a power company gave an aptitude test to its employees, and they were sued for discrimination. Why? Because black employees didn't do as well on these aptitude tests. Now, the Civil Rights Act explicitly allowed companies to do this, but despite that, the Supreme Court ruled it could only do so if it did not disadvantage blacks. In other words, this is the language of affirmative action law these days. It's disparate impact. In other words, if it negatively affects, if the outcome is negative for African Americans, it's unconstitutional. In other words, within a few years, within 6 or 7 years of the passage of the Civil Rights Administration, the rights regime went from, trying to rectify injustices and, ensure equality before the law, to trying to enforce equality of outcomes. And in the intervening years, of course, this mechanism has been applied to lots of sorts of areas beyond race. With the goal of reshaping, if you want to call it social engineering, call it that, but that's what it is. And what we're going to see, this is going to lead to one historian, C. Vann Woodward, who was a historian at the time. He was a Southern historian, but someone who was opposed to segregation and wrote books against it. He was a left winger, but he became a right winger by the end of his life because he was worried about the scope of the civil rights, legislation as it emerged. And he referred to the civil rights movement as a second Reconstruction. And that was partly meant as a warning. The idea, again, remember how the first Reconstruction worked out? When you used force and coercion to try to get people to be more whatever. And this is one of the things that people are going to get bitterly divide people in the Democratic Party in the late 60s. Of course, it's still with us because you still have that divide between people who say, no, the goal of civil rights should be, just enforcing equality before the law. And people say, no, we have to actually, make outcomes equal, otherwise it's unjust. And it's only grown ever since then, that whole rights regime. But that's the sort of interplay it opens up in the late 1960s. That is all I have for you. Hopefully this lecture gave you some food for thought. Thank you for listening. I'll see you guys next time.